Aspen Hollow, Idaho Territory, 1884. There is a particular kind of steadiness a man learns when he has spent 3 decades listening to other people's hearts for a living, the understanding that a pulse tells the truth even when the person attached to it does not. And Cornelius Bragg had built his whole medical practice on that particular steadiness. He was 57 years old, the only doctor for 30 miles in any direction, a position he had held since arriving in Aspen Hollow as a young physician fresh out of his Eastern training. And the town had come to depend on him so thoroughly over the decades that most residents could not properly recall a time before Doc Bragg had tended their broken bones and difficult births and quiet deathbeds alike. He was tall and spare, his years of constant riding between scattered homesteads keeping him lean despite his age, his hair and beard gone fully gray, his hands remarkably steady still despite the decades of precise work they had performed. His wife, Miriam, had died 9 years back of the same fever that occasionally swept through mining country, a particular cruelty Cornelius had never fully made peace with, that a man who had saved so many others' lives had been entirely unable to save the one life that mattered most to him personally. She used to tell him, in gentler years before the fever took her, that a good doctor's greatest weakness was believing his own exhaustion somehow served his patients better than proper rest ever could, an observation he had laughed off at the time and had come, in the years since her death, to understand with painful clarity as the most accurate diagnosis anyone had ever offered him. In the years since, he had thrown himself into his practice with an intensity that left little room for much else, riding out to the most remote homesteads himself, rather than sending word for patients to come to him, working himself to the point of genuine exhaustion on a regular basis. And the town had come to regard this tireless devotion as simply Doc Bragg's particular character, a man married entirely to his work now, rather than to any person. Aspen Hollow sat in a narrow mountain valley surrounded by aspen groves that turned brilliant gold each autumn. A modest mining and ranching community with a mercantile, a church, a small schoolhouse, and Cornelius's own modest medical office standing near the center of town, its window lettered simply with his name and profession. The town regarded him with the particular deep respect reserved for a person whose skill genuinely meant the difference between life and death. And several of the older residents had taken, over the years, to quietly worrying among themselves about who might eventually replace him, since Doc Bragg showed no evident interest in training a successor, or, for that matter, in much of anything beyond his own tireless work. His days ran from before dawn until well past dark, patient consultations filling every available hour, house calls extending his reach into the surrounding mountain country whenever a homestead family could not manage the journey into town themselves, a pace that had remained essentially unchanged for 9 consecutive years. Selah Warden was 25 years old and had arrived in Aspen Hollow that spring, having trained for 2 years as a nursing assistant under a respected physician back in Denver before the Territorial Mining Company recruiting doctors and medical support for the region's scattered mining camps had assigned her to assist Cornelius directly, an arrangement that would have him teaching her the finer points of frontier medicine while she handled the growing administrative and nursing demands his solo practice could no longer properly manage alone. She had accepted the assignment with genuine enthusiasm, viewing the remote posting as exactly the kind of hands-on frontier training that would serve her whole career well, though she had not, admittedly, expected to arrive and find the celebrated Doc Bragg working himself so thoroughly toward exhaustion that his own condition would become one of her very first professional concerns. She had light red hair, kept practical, and pinned back for the demanding work, bright and coppery even in the office's dim lamplight, and favored a light blue dress protected by a practical apron that generally carried the marks of whatever medical work the day had required. She was strikingly capable and had already earned, within her first month, the genuine respect of patients who had initially expressed some skepticism about a young woman assisting in medical matters previously handled entirely by Doc Bragg himself. Her father, a country doctor back in Ohio who had died of his own overwork when Selah was 19, used to tell her that medicine was the only profession where genuine care and technical skill had to work in perfect partnership, that a doctor with skill but no warmth healed bodies while leaving something essential untreated, and Selah had carried that instruction into her own training, and it had made her, young as she was, unusually attentive to exactly which of her patients needed reassurance alongside their treatment. It was in her second week that Selah, reviewing Cornelius's patient records late one evening after the office had officially closed, noticed that he had not taken a single full day free from work in the 9 years since his wife's death, working through illness, exhaustion, and even his own minor injuries without ever once properly resting, a pattern that struck her, reading through the careful medical records he kept so meticulously for every patient, but apparently never applied to himself as its own particular kind of illness left entirely untreated. "You have not taken a proper rest day in 9 years, she observed the following morning, setting his own patient ledger before him as evidence. "I have patients who need attending," he said, not looking up from the instrument he was cleaning. "Your patients would survive one Sunday without you," she said. "I am considerably less certain you will survive 9 more years at this particular pace." He looked up at that, faintly surprised by the direct challenge. This young woman, barely 2 months into her position, already presuming to diagnose the doctor himself. "You sound remarkably confident for someone 2 months into frontier practice," he observed. "I sound like someone who watched my own father work himself into an early grave through exactly this pattern," she said, plain and unflinching. "I would rather not watch it happen twice." That should have been the whole of it, a professional observation offered and received, the kind of practical workplace concern any conscientious assistant might raise. Except that Selah, having raised the concern once, found herself unable to simply let the matter drop, and began, over the following weeks, quietly managing Cornelius's schedule with an increasingly firm hand, turning away non-urgent requests on his behalf, insisting he actually eat proper meals during the workday rather than skipping them entirely, and gradually, through sheer persistent effort, carving small pockets of genuine rest into a schedule that had previously allowed for none whatsoever. "You did not have to reorganize my entire week," he told her, the first time he noticed just how thoroughly she had rearranged his patient schedule. "I know," she said. "Seemed a foolish thing to let a good doctor work himself into the exact condition he spends his own days treating in everyone else." Cornelius, in turn, began noticing things about Selah's own circumstances. The fact that she had been managing considerable administrative and medical responsibility with almost no proper training in the business side of frontier practice, learning entirely through trial and difficult error during her first uncertain weeks. And he began, without much comment, spending his own evening hours teaching her the finer points of running a practice, bookkeeping and supply management, and the particular diplomatic skill required to properly manage difficult patients, knowledge that would serve her considerably beyond her current position. "I know you did not have to spend your own evenings teaching me all this," she told him, some weeks into these informal lessons. "I know," he said, echoing her own words back at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile, an expression his own gray beard had not much practiced in recent years. "Seemed a foolish thing to let good potential go untrained when I had the evening hours and the considerable experience to properly share it." It was in June that Selah mentioned, in passing conversation, that the office's small examination room ran uncomfortably cold through the mountain evenings, the single stove struggling to heat both rooms evenly, a small inconvenience she had simply accepted as part of the practice's aging building, mentioning it more as idle observation than genuine complaint. Cornelius, hearing of it, spent a full Saturday afternoon installing a second small stove himself, sourcing the parts from the mercantile and doing the whole installation without mentioning a word of it to her beforehand, so that Selah arrived Monday morning to find the examination room finally holding proper warmth through even the coldest mountain evenings. "I did not ask you to fix the cold room," she told him, genuinely surprised by the unannounced improvement. "I know," he said. "Seemed a foolish thing to let a good nurse work cold hands through delicate procedures when I had a Saturday free and the proper materials on hand." He kept an old patient mule named Hippocrates, who had carried him to countless remote homesteads over the years and had settled, in his own advancing age, into mostly ceremonial duty around the office grounds, and Hippocrates took an immediate liking to Selah that surprised even Cornelius, the old mule braying enthusiastically whenever she approached, as though the animal himself had already settled a question the two humans were still working through separately. The town noticed, as small towns invariably do. Mrs. Cordelia Ashby, who ran the mercantile, remarked to her husband that the new nursing assistant seemed to have accomplished something no one else had managed in 9 years, actually getting Doc Bragg to occasionally leave his office before full dark. And old Nathaniel Poole, who ran the livery and had known Cornelius since his arrival decades prior, observed that the doctor had taken to whistling while he worked lately, a small habit nobody had heard from him since well before his wife's death. Cornelius told himself he was simply grateful for competent, much-needed assistance after 9 years of managing everything alone, the plain professional relief of finally having reliable help. Selah told herself she was simply doing thorough, conscientious work, nothing more complicated than good professional practice paired with genuine concern for a colleague's well-being. Neither explanation held up especially well under close examination, but neither of them examined it too closely, because the examining threatened to surface something both had reasons to leave carefully alone. Cornelius's fear, when he finally sat with it honestly one evening after Selah had gone for the day, wore the exact shape 9 years of grief and overwork had built for it. He was 57 years old, 32 years Selah's senior, and he had spent nearly a decade believing his own capacity for close attachment had been buried alongside Miriam, that whatever remained of him afterward was suited only for tireless work rather than genuine partnership with anybody. A conclusion he had reached gradually and defended fiercely, mostly to himself, in the years since her passing. He told himself that whatever warmth had grown between them belonged strictly to professional gratitude, that a woman as capable and as young as Selah deserved a future considerably more promising than attaching herself to an aging, work-consumed widower who had already proven, through 9 years of evidence, that he did not know how to properly care for himself, let alone properly care for somebody else. He filed the matter into the safest available category and told himself the category would hold, even as it grew steadily less convincing, with every evening lesson that felt less like professional instruction and more like something he genuinely looked forward to. Selah's own fear wore a quieter, more practical shape. She had come to Aspen Hollow specifically to build a genuine medical career, and she wondered privately whether attaching herself romantically to the very physician training her might undermine the professional credibility she was still actively establishing, transform her from a promising nursing assistant into simply the doctor's young companion in the eyes of a territory that already regarded women in medicine with some skepticism, a concern she had watched play out for other women in her own training who had let personal attachments complicate their professional standing. She told herself, therefore, that what she felt toward Cornelius was simple professional admiration for a genuinely skilled, dedicated physician, nothing more, and kept her manner carefully professional even as the feeling grew, week over week, into something considerably harder to keep so simply categorized. It was around this time that the Territorial Mining Company's regional supervisor, reviewing Selah's assignment progress during a visit to Aspen Hollow, mentioned that a younger, unmarried physician in a considerably larger territorial town had specifically requested her transfer, citing her evident talent and suggesting the move would offer her significantly better long-term career prospects than remaining in a small mountain practice, an opportunity the supervisor presented with obvious enthusiasm, certain that Selah would recognize the clear professional advantage such a transfer represented. The formal offer arrived in writing the following week, naming a considerably higher salary and a modern hospital facility that dwarfed Cornelius's own modest office in every practical measure, exactly the sort of advancement any ambitious young nurse ought to seriously consider. I want to pause the story here for just a moment, because this is exactly the point where a man who has spent 9 years convincing himself he does not deserve close attachment has to watch genuine opportunity, wrapped in every practical advantage, arrive to take away the one thing that had finally made his tireless work feel less like penance. Cornelius had spent weeks insisting to himself that his feelings for Selah belonged strictly to professional gratitude. He was about to discover exactly how much that insistence cost him, watching it nearly hand her whole promising future to a territory considerably larger than the small mountain town he had spent 3 decades tirelessly serving. If you have been enjoying this story tonight, I would love to know whereabouts in the world you are joining us from, whether that is somewhere across the United States, up in Canada, over in the United Kingdom or Australia, or anywhere else this old story happens to have traveled tonight. Do drop your country down in the comments below. It genuinely means a great deal to us to see how far these tales reach. Now, let us get back to Aspen Hollow, because Cornelius Bragg is about to discover whether 9 years of careful self-denial can survive one honest conversation. Cornelius heard of the transfer offer through the mining company's usual channels and spent several days turning the news over with a discomfort that surprised him considerably. A man well past the age for such feelings, arriving finally at a conclusion, he found himself entirely unwilling to accept that watching Selah Warden transfer to a larger, more promising territorial practice represented a loss he had no adequate professional language left to properly explain. He found her at the office one evening after the day's patients had finished, reviewing the transfer paperwork the supervisor had left with her, the lamp casting long shadows across the careful medical charts lining his walls. "I heard about the transfer offer," he said, forgoing any pretense of routine evening business. "Word travels fast in a town this size," she said, setting the paperwork aside. "I've spent weeks telling myself I was simply grateful for competent assistance," he said, "and in those weeks, nothing has once made me want to argue with that story, until I saw that transfer paperwork sitting there and felt something considerably less professional than gratitude." "Cornelius," she said, careful, her voice dropping quieter than her usual brisk manner, "why has it taken you this long to say anything plainly?" He was quiet a long moment, the office settling around them in the evening light. "Because I built my whole existence, these past 9 years, around the belief that I had nothing left in me suited for close attachment," he finally said, plain in a way that cost him visibly. "I watched Miriam die of a fever I could not properly treat, and I decided, somewhere in that grief, that the sensible path forward was simply tireless work rather than risking that particular loss again." The office held very still, evening light settling across the careful rows of medical instruments and patient records. Selah looked at him a long moment before she finally spoke. "I have heard more than once from more than one person in this town exactly what they think of the growing warmth between us," she said, her voice steady despite the evident weight of what she was about to say. "They call you too old for me, Cornelius." Mrs. Ashby said as much directly, not unkindly, but plainly, the last time I stopped at the mercantile. He absorbed that a long moment, something in his expression settling into resigned acceptance even before she finished speaking. "Then perhaps they are not entirely wrong to say it," he said. "I did not say I agreed with them," she said. And there, finally, her voice dropped to something close to a whisper, the particular quiet reserved for words too important for anything louder. "I said I have heard it. I have not once found myself believing it. 32 years is a considerable number, Cornelius. I have never once pretended otherwise. But I have watched you save lives in this valley for 9 years, running while systematically neglecting your own, and I find myself considerably more interested in the years we might actually build together than in the arithmetic everyone else seems so determined to keep reciting." "Is that an answer?" he asked, needing the plain word. "It is considerably more than an answer," she whispered. "Then let's give them something to count," she said, the smallest true smile finding her mouth despite the gravity of the moment. "Let them count the years we actually spend together, properly, honestly, rather than the years already behind either of us." Cornelius Bragg, 57 years old and certain that very evening that close attachment was simply not a comfort his own grief-worn nature could properly sustain, crossed the small distance of his own office and kissed her, careful at first, the way a man approaches anything he has spent nearly a decade convincing himself he no longer deserved, and then considerably less careful. While outside, Hippocrates brayed once into the settling dusk, as though offering his own considered approval. Word moved through Aspen Hollow with predictable speed once their courtship became evident. Mrs. Ashby declared she had suspected it since the evening lessons began. The territorial supervisor, informed that Selah intended to decline the transfer, expressed genuine surprise but reasonable professional grace, and old Nathaniel Poole claimed, with evident satisfaction, that he had known it the moment Doc Bragg started whistling again. They married that autumn, once the aspen groves surrounding Aspen Hollow had turned their full brilliant gold, in a small ceremony at the town church with a considerable portion of the valley in attendance, decades of grateful patience turning out to celebrate the physician who had tended their whole community so faithfully. Selah wore light blue rather than any traditional bridal white, having decided that a woman ought to be married in whatever genuinely suited her rather than whatever convention demanded. And she looked, standing at the front of that small church with the golden autumn light streaming through the windows, exactly as striking as Cornelius had quietly believed since that first bold morning she confronted him about his neglected rest. His hands, steady enough for 3 decades of precise medical work, trembled slightly saying his vows, a fact Selah would tease him about gently for years afterward. And when it came his turn to speak beyond the standard words, he told her plainly that he had spent 9 years believing himself entirely finished with close attachment, and that she had proven, one reorganized schedule at a time, that a man could be entirely wrong about his own careful diagnosis of his own condition. Old Nathaniel Poole, watching from a pew near the back, was overheard remarking afterward that he had never once witnessed a courtship conducted so thoroughly through patient schedules and stove installations, and doubted he ever would again, a sentiment several other longtime residents echoed as the whole small church settled into the particular warm commotion that follows any wedding a community has watched unfold slowly, one quiet act of care at a time. Their first year together settled into a genuine medical partnership neither of them had fully anticipated. Selah's growing skill and Cornelius's decades of accumulated experience combining into a practice that served the valley considerably more thoroughly than either had managed separately. Patients now traveling from farther reaches of the territory, specifically for the reputation their combined skill had earned. Actual rest days now built permanently into a schedule that had previously allowed for none. He built her a proper private examination room that first winter, separate from his own, equipped exactly to her growing specialty in maternal and infant care, because he had noticed, without her mentioning it twice, precisely what her developing practice needed, drafting the plans himself over several careful evenings with the same precision he brought to his own medical notes and consulting her only on the color of the trim, wanting the room to arrive as a genuine surprise. Mrs. Ashby took to remarking at the Mercantile that the whole valley had benefited considerably from whatever had finally convinced Doc Bragg to properly rest, a development she attributed, correctly, entirely to his new wife's persistent influence, and several of the older ranching families who had known Cornelius since his own arrival. Decades prior, began quietly remarking, with evident satisfaction, that he seemed a full decade younger since his marriage, a compliment Cornelius accepted with the same dry humor he had begun bringing to most personal conversations. It was not without its harder moments. That following spring, a difficult mining accident tested both of them severely, working through a brutal 30-hour stretch to save as many injured miners as possible. Selah's hands steady throughout despite her own exhaustion, Cornelius directing the chaotic effort with the calm authority 3 decades of experience had given him. Selah found herself, in the exhausted aftermath, terrified by how thoroughly she had watched Cornelius push himself back toward his old, dangerous pattern of complete self-neglect, recognizing in his gaunt, determined face the exact expression she had first diagnosed as illness back when their partnership began. The same hollow-eyed exhaustion she had once confronted him about across his own patient ledger. She raised the fear directly rather than letting it fester silently, sitting him down the following evening once the immediate crisis had properly passed. Cornelius, hearing her genuine concern, did not dismiss it. He told her plainly that crisis work would sometimes require exactly that kind of temporary sacrifice, but that he would commit going forward to genuine recovery time afterward rather than simply returning immediately to his old unsustainable pace. And Selah, hearing him choose honest partnership over silent self-sacrifice, found her fear easing into something they could manage together rather than something she carried alone. 3 years passed, and on a bright September afternoon, almost exactly to the day since Selah had first confronted him about his neglected rest days, she stood in the doorway of her own examination room, their young daughter Miriam Rose, coppery-haired like her mother, perched on her hip and reaching toward the golden aspen leaves drifting past the window with delighted, fearless hands. Old Hippocrates, considerably slower now himself, still grazed contentedly in the small paddock behind the office, one ear perpetually cocked toward whichever direction footsteps happened to be approaching from. "That count you mentioned back when we married," Cornelius said, coming in from his own morning rounds, hanging his hat by the door with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything else in his careful, deliberate life. "I believe we are keeping it rather well." "We are," she said, smiling. 3 years, one thriving practice, considerably more rest than you managed in the 9 years before I arrived, and a daughter who already shows every sign of inheriting her father's steady hands." "She shows every sign of inheriting her mother's stubbornness," he said, "and I consider that the more valuable inheritance by far." I want to stop here for just a moment before we close this story out, because I believe there is something in it worth sitting with tonight. We often let a town's casual arithmetic about age and suitability stand in for our own honest assessment of what actually matters in a partnership, allowing other people's comfortable distance from our particular circumstances to substitute for genuine understanding of what we ourselves have actually witnessed and experienced together. Cornelius Bragg had spent 9 years treating an entire valley's wounds while leaving his own grief entirely untreated, and it took a young woman brave enough to diagnose that pattern honestly, and then brave enough to keep choosing him despite what the town's easy math suggested, to finally offer him the treatment he had never once thought to prescribe himself. There is a particular irony in a healer who spends decades attending to everyone else's suffering while systematically ignoring his own, and Aspen Hollow had watched that pattern unfold for 9 years without anyone quite knowing how to properly intervene, respecting Doc Bragg's evident competence too much to question the tireless devotion that competence had become. Selah's willingness to name the pattern plainly, on her very second week of employment no less, took a particular kind of courage that had nothing to do with her age and everything to do with her clear-eyed refusal to let respect curdle into silence. Selah's whispered challenge that evening, inviting them both to give the town something worth actually counting, was never really about defying arithmetic. It was about insisting that years spent in genuine partnership, built on honest care and mutual devotion, count for considerably more than years already accumulated on either side of a birth certificate. Sometimes the bravest response to being called too old or too young or too anything for somebody is simply choosing to build a count worth remembering, one honest year at a time, until the original objection stops mattering entirely. Thank you so much for spending this hour with Cornelius and Selah tonight, wherever in this wide world you happen to be listening from. I would love to know down in the comments, were you rooting for them from that very first bold confrontation about neglected rest? Or did it take you a little longer to trust that this particular kind of steady partnership was the real thing? If this story kept you good company this evening, a like on this video and a subscribe to the channel mean a great deal to us and cost you nothing at all. And if you know someone who might need a quiet, gentle hour like this one, please do consider passing it along to them. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you find something worth counting alongside somebody who truly deserves the years. Until next time, keep writing.